Sandra asked me to just give a few-minute overview and maybe tell a couple of stories, and I'm going to try to be brief because I think that the goal of this session is to engage you all, and people don't engage, at least in my life, by sitting and listening, engage, but by having some dialogue. Because let me just say some things that are obvious, sort of fleshing out details of, mortality rate covers at 100%, which people sometimes ask me, so what's new in the field of palliative care? I go, well, human beings are mortal. Americans don't like to talk about this, but the fact of our mortality is the one thing, the one health issue that affects every single one of us and every person we love predictably, and we know it's going to happen. Childbirth, those of us who were born, most of us didn't have anything to do with planning that. Right? But death is the only thing. Second, it really, really matters to every single one of us, and if we look back on experiences we've had or worry about the future, it really, really matters to us what it's like. What those last days, weeks, or months are like, and yet we don't talk about that. Third, in part because none of us talk about it, and we're Americans, we act as if we can defeat that. Doctors and patients collude in this. It isn't just the doctors that want to talk about it, they know the patients don't want to talk about it. Our whole health system is utterly designed, maybe even perfectly designed, to not do this well. Right? You come into the hospital, doctors won't even talk to you most of the time about your mortality. If they try to, you don't want to talk about that. You're talking about what kinds of things might cure, even when they know things aren't curable, and the result is things like 70% of Americans in virtually every survey say that they want to die at home, and 70% die in hospitals or nursing homes. A large fraction of patients die with significant pain, suffering in the last phase of life. The ones that don't have significant pain and suffering, they and their family have been worrying about that all the time, even though with today's advances in pain medications, it's virtually 100% of the time possible that I or another doctor can control your pain. So in terms of you and the lives and the future of the people you love, we need to do a much better job. Second thing I would say, because we're actually here not to talk about medical hospital-related things, although talk all you want to about those things, is the fact of mortality, when people are conscious of that or aware of that, intensifies almost everything about life. I used to, maybe even having seen TV shows or movies or whatever, think, oh, somebody's going to die, they have this revelation, they change, they become this incredibly different person, they found God or whatever. That's a very rare experience in my career. Mostly people become even more themselves, or they're shattered and they become sort of unrecognizably not themselves. But it's not usually this sort of revelation and now suddenly they're Mother Teresa or something like that. If you want to understand and see humanity at its most intensive, its best, its worst, and all of that, then seeing or telling stories about human beings, individuals, and families when mortality is looming, I think is the most intensive, richest sort of area to look for some of those things. When we do that well, and it's families actually often more important than doctors, nurses, and others. Doctors and nurses, in some ways, I think, when we do our job best, we're a little more like the concept of midwives. The midwife doesn't deliver the baby. The midwife helps the woman deliver her baby, but it's the woman who's like delivering the baby. And so doctors and nurses in that kind of role. We can be helpful, but it's really the patient and their family and their loved ones that's what the story is really all about. So let me tell two quick stories that in some ways are horrible because they're both stories of young people who died of incurable cancer. One of them you can read about on the blog that her wife wrote about her. So if you want to Google I Heart, H-E-A-R-T, Candace, C-A-N-D-A-C-E, one word, .org has the blog where her wife Stephanie tells the story. Candace was a 40-year-old woman, completely healthy, did everything perfect, mammograms, pap smears, all those things, athletic, and not far from our hospital one morning, it looked like she was having a stroke after you have a stroke, so Stephanie called an ambulance, raced her to Beth Israel, and she was having a major stroke. or how does a 40-year-old woman healthy have a major stroke? Well, it turned out as they were then evaluating what was going on, she had advanced pancreatic cancer. Cancer can increase your blood's clotting, and that's why she had the stroke. Okay. But it looked like cancer on the CAT scan, so they had to do a biopsy.
Because we ourselves
we can watch this.
everything that I'm seeing.
Stop it.
What's the dose of this medicine? What's the chemotherapy?
Sorry.
But in order to prove this cancer, you have to do a biopsy. She was on anticoagulation for the stroke. So they stopped her for just a few hours so they could do the biopsy, and she had another massive stroke. And ended up with one half of her body totally paralyzed. She had to get to rehab in order to get strong enough to have chemotherapy. There was a whole nightmare in that because her health insurance wouldn't cover the rehab that she wanted. It's a whole different story. Other complications with more blood clots and things. She ended up being in our hospital for about 40 days until she died there. And yet, during that time, and you can read on the blog, always wanted to fight for life. With her wife Stephanie, her father, her mother had died, her aunt and other people in the room. I have never been in a room that was as full of life and love all the way through to the end. Courage, humor, and Candace was the source of this with other people around, at the same time as there was no bullshit about desperately hoping she gets strong enough for chemotherapy. I went in there one day, and I'll just leave you with this impression of what this woman was capable of doing. It was actually a Saturday morning. I went in about lunchtime. I walk in, and Candace is there. She could only partly speak because of the stroke. But Stephanie said, "So how's your day?" She said, "Oh, we had a wonderful morning." I go, "Like what?" And she said, "Well, we had fun with the nurse and then the senior resident." I said, "What do you have?" So the nurse came in that morning to check on Candace. And lifts up the sheets to sort of see how things are, and screams and jumps back because there's this otter animal looking out at her under the sheets. It's actually Candace's favorite character from the Muppets. I forget the name of the otter who's there. Right? The nurse is like totally terrified, then finally comes down and looks at it. They thought that was so much fun that they actually did that for each doctor they came in. And there are other things, but you can read about those kinds of things in the blog. That her wife wrote. The human dignity under that kind of stress, and losing your wife at age 40 is almost mind-boggling, and yet I think there's stories in there that are real, that are about as powerful as any I think can imagine you writing. Second patient, also earlier this year, I'll call him Felipe, came into our hospital, also he was actually 41, with severe abdominal pain. It turned out that he had colon cancer that had ruptured his intestines. He had major surgery required to do that. And as he was recovering from surgery, his second hospital day, his daughter Angelise, named as Angel, was born. So when I first met him and went to his room, he's got incurable metastatic cancer. Said, "How are you doing?" And he said, "I'm going to be fine. Angelise is keeping me alive." He was a bodybuilder. His whole room was postered with 9 or 8.5 by 11 construction paper drawings from all of the kids, in his school, sort of get well, all of that. Went through chemotherapy and other things, which ended up having complications, not working. There was no more that we could do, but Felipe, one of the nurses came out of the room one time when I was talking to him and said, "Is he always like that?" And I go, "Like, what do you mean?" He said, "The denial." I go, "Well, like, what do you mean the denial?" I said, "Well, he told you he was going to beat this." Right? And I said, "It's not denial, it's not unrealistic. He knows the odds. I talked to him absolutely directly, but he's a bodybuilder." His whole life was never, ever, ever admit you can't do something. Inspired all these kids. He knew the statistics. We would joke about, well, medical science says this, but he said, "I know, doctor, but I'm going to beat this." When it finally became clear that we had nothing more medically to offer him, and the only way to get nutrition was called TPN through a vein, but that required to be in the hospital far from home, which is about 60 miles away. The only way he could be nearer home was if he stopped that, which I never knew what that meant. Long conversations with him and his brother and his girlfriend, Angelise's mother. He chose home over that. went home to a wonderful hospice residence, spent the last 3 weeks of his life there with Angelise there, keeping him alive every day, even though he knew these were the last days. And when you went to the memorial service with him, with his students and other people all there, they were celebrating this incredible life, even though it had ended at age 41. Again, in that story, the courage, the love, the determination, I would say, because both for Candace and Felipe, they looked death in the eye. They knew it was coming, they were horrified, they had really hard times, but the love and support that they had made every single day precious, more meaningful than it had ever been before in their life. It totally sucked, I'm very direct people, totally sucked that they had this disease. But the story of their lives is something that I think is and will be always forgettable to everyone around them. You know, that's what mortality, when we talk about it and prepare for it and have it bring out the appreciation and love of life because we know it's so precious can be. And I think there are a lot of stories to write about that.